The leading scientific theory about why humans cry says tears are a signal, built to be seen, built to summon help and comfort from other people. So why do you sometimes cry completely alone? No one to see it, no one to help, just you, in a room by yourself, crying anyway. If tears are a signal, who exactly is supposed to be receiving it? Here's what's genuinely interesting. This isn't a flaw in the theory. When researchers who study crying looked closely at when and where people actually cry, the alone part turned out to be more complicated and more revealing than it first appears. Let's go. Start with the baseline oddity here. Emotional tears, crying in response to feelings rather than physical irritation, don't improve your vision, don't protect your eyes from anything, and have no clear, direct physiological necessity. Ad Vingerhoets, a professor at Tilburg University and widely described as one of the foremost researchers studying crying, has spent much of his career examining exactly this puzzle. Emotional crying, in the specific form humans do it, appears to be unique to our species, which raises the real question researchers in this area have been chasing for decades. What is it actually for? If crying has no obvious physical job, maybe the tears themselves hold a clue. Someone actually collected them to find out, and what was inside them was stranger than expected. Here's a piece of biochemistry that adds real texture, along with an honest correction. In 1981, biochemist William Frey, then at the St. Paul Ramsey Medical Center in Minnesota, published research in the American Journal of Ophthalmology, comparing emotional tears, collected while subjects watched sad films, to reflex tears collected from onion cutting. He found emotional tears contained roughly 24% higher protein concentration, along with elevated levels of hormones, including ACTH, a marker closely tied to the body's stress response. Frey proposed a popular follow-on theory, that crying literally excretes stress-related chemicals from the body, functioning as a kind of biological release valve. That specific toxin removal theory hasn't held up well under scrutiny. Other researchers have pointed out that the actual quantities of these substances lost through tears are almost certainly too small to meaningfully affect the body's chemistry. And Vingerhoets himself has said he attempted to replicate Frey's original protein finding twice, without success. What does hold up is the more basic finding. Emotional tears are measurably, chemically distinct from tears triggered by physical irritation, not just tears you happen to be sad while producing. Whatever crying is doing, your body treats it as a biologically different event depending on why you're doing it. So the tidy crying flushes out stress chemicals idea mostly drained away. What replaced it points not inward at your own body, but outward at everyone around you. The dominant theory, argued by researchers including Vingerhoets and neurologist Michael Trimble, treats tears as a communicative signal, a nonverbal, hard-to-fake language of vulnerability and need that promotes social support and bonding from others. Supporting research has found that visible tears reliably increase observers' willingness to offer help and comfort to the person crying, compared to the same expression of distress without visible tears. That's real, tested evidence that tears do something socially that words or facial expression alone don't fully replicate. And that signal might travel further than anything anyone can see. It may be reaching the people near you through a channel you don't even know you're broadcasting on. Here's a genuinely strange layer that pushes the signal theory even further into territory most people have never heard of. In 2011, researcher Noam Sobel and colleagues at the Weizmann Institute of Science, in a study published in the journal Science, collected odorless emotional tears from women watching sad films, and had men sniff them without knowing what they were smelling. Merely sniffing these tears measurably reduced the men's self-rated sexual arousal, lowered physiological arousal measures, and reduced their testosterone levels. And brain scans showed reduced activity specifically in regions associated with sexual arousal. The tears appeared to function as a chemo signal, similar to a phenomenon already documented in mice, entirely below the level of conscious smell. It's worth being upfront that this specific finding has had a mixed replication record. Some follow-up studies have failed to replicate parts of it, while at least one independent study specifically replicated the testosterone reduction effect. The overall picture remains genuinely debated among researchers, rather than settled. But even as an open question, it points at something worth sitting with. If tears carry any kind of chemical signal at all, that signal may be operating on people around you in ways that have nothing to do with them consciously seeing you cry. A layer of the tears as communication story running completely outside of sight. But all of this assumes there's someone there to receive the signal, which drops us right back onto your original question, and onto a twist in the data most people find genuinely surprising. This is the part that reframes your original question. When Vingerhoets and colleagues actually studied the contextual conditions under which people cry, not just assuming, but checking, they found that people predominantly cry in the presence of other people or in situations tied closely to relationships and attachment figures, rather than in truly isolated, disconnected solitude. Even crying that happens while you're physically alone often turns out, on closer look, to be closely tied to a specific relationship, thinking about a person, anticipating telling them something, processing something that happened with them. Even your loneliest looking cry usually has someone's name quietly attached to it, even if they're not in the room. There's an even sharper piece of evidence for this: tears that appear to literally wait for the right person to be there before they fall. Here's a specific, well-documented pattern that supports this directly. Vingerhoet's research describes a phenomenon called delayed crying, tears that get held back in a context where crying isn't socially appropriate, like at work during a conflict, and then are released later, once the person is in a safe, private, or relationally significant context, often specifically at home with a partner or close attachment figure. This is strong evidence that crying isn't randomly triggered by distress alone. It's tied to a sense of who the right audience is, even when that audience isn't physically present in the exact moment the tears start. Which forces an uncomfortable question the research doesn't dodge. Does all this crying actually make you feel better? The honest answer is messier than you'd hope. It's worth correcting a popular assumption before going further, because the research here is genuinely more complicated than a good cry always helps. Psychologists Jonathan Rottenberg, Lauren Bilesma, and Vingerhoets himself reviewed the available evidence on crying and mood and found a striking split. Survey-based studies, where people simply recall and report on their own past crying episodes, consistently find that most people say they felt better afterward. But controlled laboratory studies, where crying is triggered by a sad film and mood is measured immediately before and after, consistently find the opposite. People who cried during the film generally reported feeling worse right afterward, not better, compared to people who watched the same sad scene without crying. A large 2011 diary study by Bilsma and colleagues, tracking over 1,000 real crying episodes across dozens of women over several weeks, helped explain the gap. Whether crying helped depended heavily on context. Criers who received social support during the episode were far more likely to report feeling better afterward than criers who didn't, and mood benefits were more likely when the underlying problem had actually gotten resolved, not just cried about. Crying itself doesn't appear to be automatically therapeutic. It's specifically crying that gets met with support or that accompanies real resolution that tends to help. Somewhere in that finding is direct scientific support for the very unglamorous truth that a good cry mostly works if someone hands you a tissue afterward, not if you're doing it alone in a locked bathroom stall between meetings. And that sets up the single most counterintuitive finding in this entire field, the one that turns the image of the lonely, sobbing person completely upside down. Here's the piece of this research that should surprise you the most. You'd assume lonelier people with more unmet emotional need would cry more. Vingerhoet's research found close to the opposite. People who report being lonely, despite lower overall well-being, tend to cry less often than people with more social bonds and support, and specifically cry less often with someone present to share it with. If crying is fundamentally a social signal aimed at eliciting support, This actually makes sense. The signal has less function and perhaps less impulse behind it when there's no one available to receive it and respond. So if the truly isolated cry less, then what on earth is going on in the genuinely solitary tears, the ones with no one in mind at all? This doesn't erase truly solitary crying. It happens, and it's real. But the research suggests it's less of a contradiction than it first appears. Some solo crying reflects the delayed crying pattern, headed toward an audience that isn't there yet. Some may reflect what Vingerhoets and others have described as a kind of self-directed signal too. Tears functioning partly as feedback to yourself, marking, "This matters to me," even without another person present to witness it. And this happens more often and more predictably than you'd guess. The numbers even split cleanly depending on who's doing the crying. Here's some concrete scale to close on. Vingerhoets and colleagues, through decades of cross-cultural survey work involving thousands of participants across dozens of countries, have found that adult women report crying somewhere around 3 to 5 times a month on average, while men report crying roughly once a month or slightly more. A consistent gender gap that shows up across essentially every culture studied, though the exact numbers vary somewhat between surveys. Notably, this gap doesn't exist yet in early childhood. Young boys and girls cry at similar rates, and the difference only opens up later, suggesting it's shaped significantly by socialization rather than being present from birth. Vingerhoets has also found that a typical crying episode lasts around 6 minutes for women and 2 to 3 minutes for men, on average, across a large international sample. And this reframes crying alone in a way that feels almost the opposite of lonely once you sit with it. If tears really are fundamentally social infrastructure, built at their evolutionary root for connection, then even the tears you cry with nobody in the room are running on machinery built for other people. The signal doesn't stop being a signal just because, in that specific moment, no one happens to be there to receive it. And the research on whether crying actually helps adds one more layer of honesty to this. The benefit was never really about the tears themselves. It was always about what happens around them, whether someone shows up, and whether whatever caused the tears actually gets resolved. So the next time you cry completely alone, that's not your body doing something pointless, or a signal firing into a void for no reason. Based on the research, it's more likely a very old, very social system, still faithfully doing its job, still oriented toward connection, even in the one moment it looks the most solitary. The theory isn't broken by the alone part. If anything, the alone part is where it makes the most sense. And whether it actually leaves you feeling better probably has less to do with the crying itself and more to do with what or who shows up next. And here's a thread worth pulling. You were already running this social machinery before you could say a single word, crying and laughing as your very first language. Why babies laugh before they can talk is its own strange story. That one's coming.